On the limitations of utopia, China Mieville once wrote, "We live in a utopia, it just isn't ours." We see it all around us in a nation packed with scams, guns, and debt, one with secret police and ruled by a cabal of conmen, drunks, rapists, pedophiles, and morons. A hellish utopia is cheered on by reactionary masses who have nothing to lose but their chains, but who see on those chains of oppression a beautiful flower, a chance to alienate their woke children, to see a child burning alive in Gaza, a policymaker pretending to share their faith, and so on. There's vanishingly little to cleverly analyze when cynicism is worn proudly, as criminals defraud us in the open, as we slide into a post-literacy already evident to every decent educator, as secret police murder the brave, as god kings are all stupid sex pests. A wild conspiracy theory, to say nothing of vulgar Marxism or simple Freudianism, already gets you 90% of the way to a correct conclusion, so what's left to analyze? Amid ICE terror and Epstein files, what follows is an attempt at a few clarifying theses. Thesis 1 on reactionaries. One of the first draft theorists of fascism, Wilhelm Reich, once more or less said that when you withhold bread, the people revolt. However, if people are taught to repress their sexuality, they feel they deserve neither their sexuality nor even bread. Suppression of material needs, he argued, such as food or housing or health care, incites the population to rebellion. But repression of sexuality anchors repression as a moral defense. The inhibition is unconscious but lashes out as a return of the repressed. The repressed inveigh against anyone they view as enjoying too much. Reproductive choice must be overturned. Marriage equality is an abomination. The trans kid must be tormented by those casting themselves as the child protectors, who nevertheless turn a blind eye when their role models are found to be avid sinners. Their inhibitions anchor their fantasies of being chosen by God. The result, Reich said, is conservatism, fear of freedom, in a word, reactionary thinking. An underanalyzed component of reaction today is a puritanically sex-negative purity culture on the right, and all who are raised in that purity culture and matured out of it know this to be true, yet it's as if a simple fact is too obvious to name. You kissed dating goodbye, you wore a purity ring, you rushed into marriage without having any semblance of a normal dating period beyond what was euphemistically cast as courtship. You swore off pornography or masturbation and failed miserably. Your minister's story is always told with the warning about having a past of which they tell you they are ashamed, or are they boasting, meant that they had no actual experience following the rules they demanded of others. Thus they had little experience with the psychic cost of following those rules or the benefits of transgressing. What follows from all of that is regret, which can be a critically beneficial moment of change, or a doubling down into further repression. The reactionary takes the latter option, and repression returns as judgment, as wrath. Reich's warning on sexuality is not the whole answer for what generates reactionary thought today, but it is a partial answer. Their anger at others stretches from their self-loathing and regret. Reich also warns something else, that each instance of mysticism is built on reactionary thinking, a caution not only for new spiritualities or artificial intelligence, but even for progressive expressions of faith today. Thesis 2. Theology and materialism. In Walter Benjamin's first thesis on the philosophy of history, he imagines a chess game in which your opponent, apparently a master, is actually a puppet controlled by a small figure out of sight, and that puppet is called historical materialism, which is always supposed to win, and the hidden figure is theology serving this view. You imagine you're analyzing material relations, money and force, but in reality a theology guides the interpretation. Slavoj Zizek inverted this dynamic to say that we are up against explicitly theological concepts today, while out of sight theology is determined by materialism. So theology becomes a type of puppet or a costume or an avatar, concealing a crude materialism. Even if you are not a materialist, your boss is absolutely a materialist. The boss must dial up surplus accumulation in palatable ways, and that's why he's always telling you, we're one big family here, or language like that, announcing an office party, which is mandatory fun, which dresses up this crude materialism in friendlier language. Those concealing avatars are crucial for keeping the materialism of surplus accumulation out of sight, because it doesn't do for him to plainly say, as a boss, "I'd like to make more money off of you without paying you more." A politician or reactionary activist cannot mandate a pizza party in the same way a boss can, though. So a more useful avatar is theology, still concealing the underlying drive of surplus accumulation. Find an absurd example in the theological vomit of Peter Thiel, co-founder of Palantir, a billionaire exemplar of the feeble-minded tech right. His co-founder at Palantir said that the goal was to, quote, "save Western civilization from our adversaries, especially communists and Islamists," end of quote. But Thiel has recently shifted focus to a lecture series on the Antichrist. He suggests the old 1990s Left Behind series was unbelievable because he cannot imagine some amoral monster holding the crowds in spellbound awe. I think that's interesting because, on the contrary, I can think of examples. But Thiel suggests that someone like Greta Thunberg fits the bill as an Antichrist for smuggling Marxism into environmentalism. Likewise, Trump can implement a plan to cut foreign aid such that he will kill an estimated 14 million people over 5 years, including 4 or 5 million children under the age of 5 years of age. But what makes more news is when he occasionally wonders if he's good enough to get into heaven. Theology. We love to see it, folks. Thesis 3. Conservatism consists of exactly one proposition. To the shame of centuries of political philosophers, a most succinct definition of conservatism emerged on a blog comment from composer Frank Wilhoit. Quote, "Conservatism consists of exactly one proposition, to wit, there must be in-groups whom the law protects but does not bind, alongside out-groups whom the law binds but does not protect." End of quote. Plato's Republic already detected a flaw in democracy. In their desire to imagine their idiosyncratic opinions as second to none, given enough time, people will choose a man of shamelessness to rob them. Perhaps his cruelty mirrors their own. Perhaps his stupidity mirrors their own. Stupidity is certainly constitutive of Trump's appeal. When people say, "he says what we secretly think," they indicate not only his racism, as commentary frequently, rightly, emphasizes, but also his confused and crumbling mental architecture. That's what feels familiar. But what is most attractive is his shamelessness. It's easy to misread shamelessness as an attractive trait. Confidence. A lesson in Corey Robin's The Reactionary Mind is that however far one stretches back into the history of conservatism, straight back to Edmund Burke, the guiding principle is hierarchy. Better men, and it usually does mean men, must rule over their inferiors. As capitalists, their hierarchy serves their own surplus accumulation, and their conservative plebeians stand in awe of entrepreneurial thieves. But this kleptocratic hierarchy also reinforces a fragile ego of those crushed by it, especially by mapping onto preferred racial, gender, and sexual hierarchies. It gives them a gun, a very phallic symbol, supposedly to protect themselves from government tyranny or people of color. Of course, the normal reason for firing a gun at a human is suicide. If deaths of despair don't take them first. Wilhoit continued, quote, "As the core proposition of conservatism is indefensible if stated baldly, it has always been surrounded by an elaborate backwash of pseudo-philosophy, amounting over time to millions of pages, all such as axiomatically dishonest and undeserving of serious scrutiny. Today, the accelerating de-education of humanity has reached a point where the market for pseudo-philosophy is vanishing. All that is left is the core proposition itself, backed up no longer by misdirection and sophistry, but by violence." End of quote. Thus, everything turns so stupid that there's nothing left to analyze, and the one principle of conservatism can now be stated openly. Thesis 4. White evangelicalism holds only one doctrine. Why cannot the white evangelicals see a difference between Christ and Nazis? Why not apply the golden rule to the question of kidnapping toddlers for concentration camps? Charging them with hypocrisy, it seems quaint. How can they cheer for pedophiles when they know what Jesus said about millstones for those who'd cause a child to stumble? How does kidnapping families for being the wrong race fit into the family values agenda? But you know they don't care, and you are right. White evangelicalism is not a separate religion, but it is a sect. Much as conservatism has only one principle, white evangelicalism really only has one doctrine, as I argued in my 2019 book, Against What Does the White Evangelical Want? I said, quote, "A few banal fantasies float across white evangelicalism. It seldom tires of arguing over hell or substitutionary atonement, biblical inerrancy, and it never misses an opportunity to judge women or non-heteronormative sexuality. This faith holds only one doctrine, an already forgiven and shameless chosenness." End of quote. To cast itself as chosen is a double theft of its supersession and its racism, cobbled together from election, pretension, settler colonialism, and so on. To be chosen includes its various fundamentalist fantasies: atonement, afterlife, perspicuity, predestination, the inability to lose one's salvation. Those are all legible under this rubric of chosenness. And its traditional nationalist chauvinism and fidelity to Trump today are legible in this way too. When I say chosenness is white evangelicalism's only doctrine, I do want to emphasize that I literally mean they would sooner give up belief in Christ's divinity than the belief that they are chosen in some sense by God. Here is a lesson I've gleaned from my work, less from my work as a political philosopher, a religion scholar, or psychoanalytic theorist, but instead from my role as a teacher. The lesson is that most people don't care very much about what they believe. Sorting convictions is a strange and tedious behavior. It takes years of study, hundreds or thousands of books, endless conversations. Sorting your convictions takes nothing more than what Gillian Rose said. It takes to be a philosopher: endless curiosity, focused attention, acceptance of unknowability, not to mention the ability to distinguish the genuinely unknowable from the as yet unknown. But most haven't the time to do this. In the classroom, a student will confidently proclaim a position. I will ask one additional probing question, and then I will often see a student fully reverse on their prior position. And this is normal. This is what humans do. And it's normal for the same reason conservatism is so childlike. Conservatism is an adolescent's way of understanding the world, a spoiled child who has never encountered anything hard or been required to empathize. The soaring heights of Burkean conservatism are a little more complex than a college freshman student rambling about something that they didn't read right before class, running full steam on cliche and unexamined ideas. Conservatism does not seek, it finds. It finds what it was told to find. In its current iteration, U.S. white evangelicalism is more or less a recent phenomenon stretching back little more than half a century, as I think of it. It's a political expression of the religious right, well, at least the political expression in the religious right clothed itself in a mythic birth out of opposition to abortion, but this, in fact, was a cover for the fading popularity of workarounds for school segregation, as argued by Randall Balmer and myself in various places. White evangelicalism is a theological improvisation around whiteness serving capital as social reproduction, especially vis-a-vis Cold War anti-communism. As a side note, it's no surprise that US-styled evangelicalism took root in countries like Brazil, shoring up support for Bolsonaro, and a state ruined by Jakarta method CIA-backed anti-communism. Globally, evangelicalism is saturated with anti-communism and anti-socialism, making it a violent method of docile social reproduction for capitalists. But domestically, even though many theological roots in evangelicalism today stretch back much further than the last half century, contemporary white evangelicalism is a response to school integration and civil rights and so on. Perhaps you could add in the sexual revolution. We don't get the insular simulacra of Christian music, Christian bookstores, Christian coffee houses, Protestant schools, without the threat of a multiracial society, and Trump taps this angst with great effect. Thesis 5. Trumpism is a perfected form of white evangelicalism. Protestantism's asset and flaw is its preference for belief over sacrament. If you are saved by grace through faith, you are saved by, in a sense, getting your thoughts right. Righteousness may express itself as improved behavior, and indeed the theory goes that the believer will be known by the fruitfulness of her faith, of course, but actions themselves neither save nor damn. What matters is belief, that is, thoughts. If Martin Luther's theology and neuroscience were Frankenstein's, we could say that whether you spend eternity in heaven or hell has everything to do with firing the correct electrical signals across trillions of synapses. What matters is personal determination of who is Lord, or in a more common example, the evangelical schoolchild learns that the Nazi who confessed Jesus as Lord is saved while his victim in the camps was not. This vile idea is internally consistent in many folk theologies of Protestantism. A countdown to the death of God surely began as soon as Luther began his protest over indulgences. In a sense, an atheist is a decent Lutheran, choosing to reject not a sacrament, but the beliefs in which they can no longer feel conviction. Nietzsche famously wondered what would happen after the death of God. Not clearly a positive development in his framing for what would fill that gap. As he wrote in the parable of the madman, quote, "How shall we comfort ourselves, the murderers of all murderers? What was holiest and mightiest that all the world has yet known has bled to death under our knives? Who will wipe this blood off of us? What festivals of atonement, what sacred games will we have to invent? Must we not become gods simply to appear worthy of it?" End of quote. Well, that was a while ago, and many horrors have transpired since. The evangelicals did not become gods, but they fashioned gods in their morally vacuous image where belief, not the treatment of actual human beings, but belief determines salvation. Thus we come to the figure of Trump, who, like Christ, is kind of a big deal, as many people are saying. Trumpism is an apex, perfected form of white evangelicalism. It's ecumenical in a strange sense if we consider Ryan Burge's research showing how many Republicans identify as born-again or evangelical even if they are not Christian. So, for example, 20% of Jewish Republicans, 33% of Muslim, 5% of atheist Republicans, and 4% of agnostic Republicans identify as evangelical or born-again on a recent survey. As a fascist project with a clear in-group and out-group, an in-group whom the law must protect but not bind, as Frank Wilhoit put it, Trumpism accepts all of those who have faith in God's wise servant. Election denial becomes a type of shibboleth. Confess him as Lord, and by your faith you are saved, which is to say, in a sense, white. Evangelicals will smile and tell you, I am not perfect, just forgiven. Nevertheless, they believe that nobody is certainly more perfect than they are. And as I wrote in a recent article on evangelical Zionism, which was thinking about what this chosenness means when most evangelicals believe that this world will soon end, and with it, the Jews who are for now useful instruments in their theology in bringing about the end times. Well, those evangelicals believe that they have a morality that you could not follow, a salvation prescribed to the unrighteous, a godly perception that you cannot fathom. You will not be able to reason them out of this until they no longer enjoy this fantasy. The world is about to end, and they salivate at the violence on the horizon. Thesis 6 on ideology. In January 2026, a Portland observer filmed an ICE agent taking pictures of her car. She asked why, and the ICE agent replied, quote, "Because we have a nice little database, and you're considered a domestic terrorist, so have fun with that," end of quote. Will she be harassed on the street now that she's in this database? Will she be harassed at home? Is this list sequestered within ICE, or will it be cross-listed with other DHS agencies? For example, will she be added to a no-fly list and only find out when she's trying to return to the country? It's unclear, but what we know is that she has entered a murky legal territory where the agent of the state has interpolated her as a terrorist. Louis Althusser once wrote 2 theses on ideology. Thesis 1 is that ideology represents an imaginary relationship of individuals to their real conditions of existence. Thesis 2 was that ideology has a material existence. So ideology is an imaginary relationship to a real situation, and it has material existences. Ideology's material existence is crucial for the purposes of reproduction. Any ideology is only ever one generation from extinction if not reproduced. Ideology is reproduced through what Althusser called ideological state apparatuses. He listed a few. For example, religious institutions, education institutions, family, law, unions, media, political parties, and then cultural institutions like literature, arts, and sports. Ideology interpolates individuals as subjects. So when ICE goons smash windows, abduct children, and murder nonviolent protesters, it's ironic that Althusser's primary example of what he means by interpolation is a police officer shouting, "Hey, you there," transforming you as an individual on the street into a target for state repression. As an imaginary relationship to a real situation, especially when under capitalism, all ideology reproduced must be more or less compliant with the needs of capitalist accumulation. The effect of ideology is that it creates a subject. Through interpolation, it creates a subject who is free to submit, or in Minneapolis, free to be shot. Thesis 7. What does the big other want? On shame, anxiety, and indifference. There is no shortage of anxiety these days. What I argued in my book Against is that white evangelicalism is a faith organized around fantasies curating the enjoyment of, not flight from, turmoil and anxiety. You seldom consciously enjoy anxiety, though the repetition of what does not work reliably signals an unconscious enjoyment of that which triggers anxiety. But what is certain is that anxiety or even guilt is preferable to shame. Evangelicalism is not entirely unique in this regard, but so many examples of how they enjoy anxiety are right there on the surface. One never needs to excavate the evangelical soul, so to speak. They find new ways to condemn themselves, so as to reassure themselves that others are even more condemned. There's always a new film to miss because the plot contains sin, an establishment to boycott because it is woke, a new way to focus on the family by hitting their children so they don't spoil, a new church which is totally better than their old church, a new prophecy chart, a new self-help devotional, a book to tell them the correct doctrines, always a book coming from the Christian inspiration section, never an academic text, or perhaps an accountability group to tell them that they are some disgusting scumbag. They enjoy the anxiety this creates, for the anxiety is read not correctly as a signal of something not working, but instead as a sign that all is well. If I feel anxious, if I'm trying to prove myself, I'm showing myself that I am actually one of the elect. Their anxiety is misinterpreted as a signal of purity. They are chosen. The reactionary consciousness is so configured as to desire to be the instrument of the big other. Whether they imagine themselves as God's righteous servant or a boss's good little worker bee, what they enjoy is knowing their place. And they are angry that you do not know your place, which is to say angry that you are not so unfree as they enjoy being unfree. They desire to submit, to yield their surplus value to an owner, or to repress their lives for a fantasy. They enjoy doing so. As the psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan put it, in its relation to desire, reality appears as marginal. Another Lacanian, Gabriella Zerzuri, once said something I think about all the time. She said, "What matters is not reality. What matters is what the subject says about reality." You will not, by a reasoned argument, interrupt a fantasy somebody is in the process of enjoying. Just as the reactionary admires shamelessness in the leader, what the reactionary consciousness must avoid at all costs is shame. Think of shame and indifference as two polar opposite ends of a spectrum, of an anxiety spectrum, perhaps. Shame and indifference outwardly manifest identically. If I'm ashamed, I do not want to speak of it. And if I'm indifferent, I have nothing to speak out in defense of anyways. So in shame or in anxiety, I might be totally silent. In the middle register is anxiety, where there's a lot of activity generated to prove myself. One would prefer to feel indifferent, but if that is not an option, then anxiety is good enough. It's definitely better than shame. And if you feel guilty, which is an anxious feeling, then at least you know where you stand. In some senses, sometimes it's preferable to feel guilt, because then at least you know where you stand vis-a-vis the big other. The evangelical enjoys guilt and anxiety, which for Lacan is always connected to the question, what does the big other want of me? What does my boss, my significant other, my God, my parents, etc., what do they want of me? What must I do to secure my attachment? What can I do to prove myself morally pure? That is anxiety, and it is not something people actually avoid, but instead enjoy often enough. The evangelical attends a new Bible study, adopts a new spiritual practice, selects a new culture war signifier to avoid shame for the same reason that an ecologically aware citizen recycles or buys carbon credits. Little to nothing is changed in the stage theater, but moral righteousness is secured, if only an imaginary righteousness rife with anxiety. It's strange to make a plea for more shame, yes, but we could use a bit more. The white evangelical says that you ought to be ashamed of your sexuality, but actually, they should be ashamed of kidnapping families, destroying the environment for future generations, or handing nuclear codes to a senile game show host. There are plenty of fine opportunities for shame today. Everyone wishes to avoid shame, though, the feeling of being seen too much in the ugly existence of one's violence. They may squabble over the supposed differences between shame and guilt, but the evangelical often deploys shame-heavy rhetoric. I'm a sinner saved by grace, I'm not perfect, just forgiven. They will deploy the shame-heavy rhetoric as boasting in disguise. And psychoanalysis calls this disavowal, which contains an acknowledgement of the truth, followed by its denial. The classic structure being, yes, I know, but even so, blah, blah, blah. Thesis 8, Fascism, a definition. Fascism is a contested term. Is it an ideology? Is it a form of behavior? Is it best left in the 1930s in specific countries? Or is it applicable today? Is it a transhistorical phenomenon? Or is it not merely a more extreme version of conservatism? And where exactly is the line between normal conservatism and fascism? During the first Trump administration, you may be aware that there was a whole kind of cottage industry online debating, is it happening here? Does this count as the F word? But now the partisans all seem to, from that debate, all seem to line up in the affirmative. And I find Robert Paxton, who wrote an excellent book, The Anatomy of Fascism, I find Robert Paxton's definition of fascism helpful, not to mention brief enough that one can commit it to memory. Paxton defined fascism this way. Fascism may be defined as a form of political behavior marked by obsessive preoccupation with community decline, humiliation, or victimhood, and by compensatory cults of unity, energy, and purity, in which a mass-based party of committed nationalists, militants, working in uneasy but effective collaboration with traditional elites, abandons democratic liberties and pursues with redemptive violence and without ethical or legal restraints goals of internal cleansing and external expansion. Paxton lists a series of motivating passions, all very much alive today. A sense of overwhelming crisis beyond the reach of any traditional solutions, the primacy of the group toward which one has duties superior to every right, whether individual or universal, and the subordination of the individual to it, the belief that one's group is a victim, a sentiment that justifies any action without legal or moral limits against its enemies, both internal and external, dread of the group's decline under the corrosive effects of individualistic liberalism, class conflict and alien influences, the need for closer integration of a pure community, by consent if possible, or by exclusionary violence if necessary. The need for authority by natural leaders, always male, culminating in a national chief who alone is capable of incarnating the group's destiny. The superiority of the leader's instincts over abstract and universal reason. The beauty of violence and the efficacy of the will, when they are especially devoted to the group's success. And finally, the right of a chosen people to dominate others without restraint from any kind of human or divine law, right being decided by the sole criterion of a group's prowess within a Darwinian struggle. Theodor Adorno once wrote something. He said, quote, Walter Benjamin once asked me in Paris during his emigration, while I was still returning to Germany sporadically, whether there were really enough torturers back there to carry out the orders of the Nazis. There were enough. End of quote. There will always be enough unemployable scumbags to carry out the orders. They took the job to do violence to civilians. It's fun for them. It's a small consolation that their children will not talk to them and their grandchildren will not whisper their name in shame of it all. You know, maybe not. The literature suggests political ideology actually transfers from parent to child at 80 or 90%, so perhaps the kids of the Gestapo will turn out rotten as well. Adorno also said that the debate about the ideals of education is trivial and inconsequential compared to a new categorical imperative imposed on the world by the Shoah: never again. We must arrange all of our thoughts and actions to prevent another relapse into barbarism. And if Rosa Luxemburg was right that bourgeois society is now at a crossroads where the only options are socialism or barbarism, we are failing miserably into the latter. Gaza proves this. Whatever naive hope we could have for liberal international order fades as families are shot, bombed, starved day and night for years without consequence, either for Israeli or American policymakers. Final thesis 10. There is still air to breathe in hell. And on that note, I conclude by alienating many of my readers. You want to ask, do reactionaries not see the hypocrisy? How could they vote for somebody with 34 felony convictions, a vulgar game show host so manifestly incompetent? But the liberal, too, is thrown into a world of moral compromise and understands the reactionaries' calculation. Do you believe, say, genocide is worse than campaign finance felonies to covering up a sex scandal? I'd say genocide is not only worse, it's infinitely worse. If in 2024 one voted for a candidate currently serving an administration greenlighting and arming a genocide, then the liberal also understands the calculation, this wretched compromise where even the worst of all possible crimes against humanity is not a red line for you morally. One compromises and then retroactively writes it off as a lesser evil. There is indeed so much to be ashamed of today. That is why you must curate popular definitions. You might insist that shame is bad and because it's about who you are, whereas guilt is good if you've done bad, and so on. But the truth is, whatever we call it, we are washed in so much violence for which shame is an appropriate response. The reactionary says you ought to feel shame for having sex, for rethinking gender binaries, for taking baby steps to learning about racism, for becoming an apostate to the faith of your childhood. What one might rightly feel shame over is a slow-rolling ecocide slipping into a new mass extinction. What one should feel shame about is killing 14 million people over 5 years by withholding aid, mainly in Africa, because it'll save a few dollars. What one should definitely feel shame about is our safety and security built atop violence elsewhere, for starving families in Gaza, for lighting children on fire, for shredding limbs off tiny bodies, for deploying thermal and thermobaric munitions burning so hot that thousands of Palestinians have simply evaporated without a trace, for calling it justice when a speechless parents wandering about the rubble with plastic trash bags containing the body parts of their toddlers' corpses. The level of evil we call good, or if not good, the lesser of two evils, is nearly unfathomable. On a life that carries on after genocide, Adorno said something about shame. The only responsible option is to deny oneself the ideological misuse of one's existence, and for the rest to behave in private as modestly, inconspicuously, and unpretentiously as required, not for reasons of good upbringing, but because of the shame that when one is in hell, there is still air to breathe.